From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We're going to start out once again with the markets again today. We're going to turn to Kaylee Lyons. And Kaylee, it looked like early on we were going to do pretty well in the markets, and then they've turned around. Is it because of some of the numbers we got on the coronavirus?
That certainly is part of it, David. You're looking at a market that perhaps is more sensitive to the rising virus cases and the threat that it could pose to the recovery. But I would note when things really turned is when we saw the tech heavyweights like Apple and Microsoft flip into negative territory as well. They are back to really roughly flat right now, which is why we're off the lows of the session. But you're still looking at the S&P 500 and the Dow down by 1.25%, 1.5% each. The relative outperformance, though, is still coming from tech. The Nasdaq is only down about 0.5, and the NYSE FANG Plus Index, which houses the biggest of the big tech stocks, is actually up by about 0.1%. And this really just speaks to a broader theme, David, in that it is the tech stocks that carry the market in one direction or another. I crunched the numbers earlier this morning, and as of yesterday's close, the S&P 500 had rallied 865 points off its lows on March 23rd. 251 of those points have come from just 5 names: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and Alphabet. That equates to 29% of the gains we've seen in the equity markets. So really underscores the fact that to a large degree, this market is held hostage by the performance of these mega cap companies. They carry us along on the upside, but they also pose a risk to us on the downside as well, David.
Yeah, and as you say, even today, tech is not down as much as some of the other people are down. Is it a risk-off day? What's going on with bonds? What's going on with gold?
So interesting you mentioned gold and bonds. So we are seeing the classic risk-off trade in the fact that the dollar is stronger, of course, seen as more of a safe haven asset, proxy for whether or not it's a risk-on, risk-off day. And you are seeing a bid into treasuries as well. The 10-year yield is down about 4 basis points. But gold is actually slightly weaker today, coming off the highest levels since back in 2011, possibly just a little bit of profit taking there. The more interesting commodity I have my eye on today is copper. Dr. Copper, usually very sensitive to the economic growth story. You'd expect copper to be under pressure on a risk-off day, but it is actually higher today as well. So that's a bit of a mystery, David.
That is a mystery. Okay, thank you so much to Kayla Lyons for that report on the markets. Well, today is also the last day of this term of the Supreme Court of the United States, and it saves some of the biggest decisions to last, 2 of them involving President Trump, about whether people could get access to his private financial records. One, the House of Representatives wanted him, the other, a New York prosecutor. Greg Storr, our Supreme Court reporter, is here to give us sort of what is more or less a split decision, Greg. So start first with this New York prosecutorial. It's a grand jury subpoena for his tax records that are in possession, as I understand it, of his accountant. What did the court say?
Yeah, that one was a pretty clear rejection of the president. Trump was arguing for absolute immunity for a president while in office from criminal investigation. So these subpoenas in the grand jury case went to his accounting firm, Mazars, and the president was arguing, while I'm in office, that is too distracting for me to have to deal with my records being subpoenaed. The Supreme Court rejected that. They also rejected the notion that the grand jury would have to meet some special heightened standard to get the president's records. They did allow the case to go forward in the lower court. The president may have other arguments to make, but it was a complete rejection of the president's positions at the Supreme Court.
Well, it did strike me. The president came out with a series of tweets basically taking this on, claiming that it was prosecutorial misconduct, that essentially his enemies had sent this back up to what he called a corrupt New York to deal with this. But he didn't make those arguments below, right? He just said, you can't come after them no matter what it is. He didn't say there was any impropriety in seeking the information from his accountants.
That's right. Yeah, it was really a position, in this case, his position was very sweeping, saying that as long as a president is in office, criminal process, meaning a subpoena that even goes to a third party that involves the president's personal information, that's out of bounds. That was the argument he was making, and that's what the Supreme Court rejected today.
Yeah, and just to be perfectly clear, as I understand it, this is a grand jury subpoena, and so if this goes forward, and in fact there aren't other arguments for the president's accountants not to turn over the records, then it goes to the grand jury. That doesn't mean we all get to see them. They're not going to be on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow, right? Grand juries tend to be quite secretive.
That's right. It's the House case that was the one where we might have been able to see them if it had come out the other way. Yes, unless we're talking about, eventually there may be, of course, an indictment out of the grand jury investigation. That's what happens, and maybe information will come out through that indictment. But just because it goes to the grand jury, unless there's a leak, which would be illegal, no, we are not going to see that information.
And it seemed to be quite important to the court that these records don't go to confidential communications from him as president. These are not things he said or did in the Oval Office. These are independent. These are his personal records having to do with taxes.
Yeah, and the reason that's important is because when the president is trying to argue, look, all this would be distracting to me, and distracting in terms of my duties as president. Well, in this case, we're talking about conduct. The Cyrus Vance, the district attorney in Manhattan, is looking into things stemming from those hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. That has nothing to do with Trump's work as president, and so it was a harder claim for him to make that this kind of information shouldn't go to a state grand jury.
So, Greg, go over to the other decision that came down involving President Trump and his records, and that was the House. They were subpoenaing to get certain records that they wanted as part of their investigation, their legislative activities. The court was not quite as receptive to what the House was doing.
Yeah, so in that case, there were 3 House committees that sent out 4 subpoenas, and they said that we have legislative things we're looking at. We're looking at presidential conflicts of interest. We're thinking about updating the money laundering laws. We're thinking about, we're exploring foreign interference in the election. And so we want these Trump financial records because they'll help us with those legislative purposes. And both sides took a pretty broad arguments in this case, and the court essentially said, "Hey, both sides have gone too far here. If we restricted Congress to the extent Trump wants, that would really hamstring Congress in its ability to do its constitutional duties. And if we did what Congress was asking us to do, there would be no limits on what they could seek in terms of presidential records." So essentially, the Supreme Court kicked the cases back to 2 federal appeals courts and said, look at them more closely and be more mindful of the potential imposition on the president.
So finally, Greg, as I say, this marks the end of this term of the court. I think it's fair to say an historic term, not only because it had the first virtual oral arguments in history, but it really took on some big cases. Give us a sense of how important this term of court specifically was.
Yeah, very, very important. I think when we look back on this term, it will in part be the term where it really became John Roberts' court. He was in the majority in every case except for one, and that included several big cases where he sided with the court's liberals involving LGBT job discrimination, involving President Trump's effort to rescind the DACA deferred deportation program, and these restrictions on abortion in Louisiana. He did side with the conservatives, and he is a Republican appointee, in an awful lot of other cases that are maybe a notch below. And then he wrote both the decisions issued today, trying to balance the needs of the president on one hand and Congress and state grand juries on the other.
Okay, thank you so much, Greg. Always great to have you on when it's the Supreme Court we're talking about. That's Greg Stohr, our Supreme Court reporter in Washington. In the meantime, yesterday, President Lopez Obrador came from Mexico and got a very warm reception at the White House. We talked with the former U.S. ambassador to Mexico. He is Tony Garza. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The mayor of Seoul, Park Won-soon, has been found dead, according to the news agency Yonhap. Park has been viewed as a potential candidate for the 2022 presidential election. We'll continue to follow this story throughout the day. Florida is still being hit hard by the coronavirus. The state reported new records in both COVID-19 deaths and new hospitalizations today. 120 Floridians died in the past 24 hours. That's up from 48 the day before. And the state's positivity rate jumped to 18.4%. Florida has had more than 232,000 confirmed cases. As David and our Greg Storer were reporting moments ago, the Supreme Court today has ruled that much of eastern Oklahoma is still American Indian territory. The justices, in a 5-4 vote, sided with a convicted child molester who argued that the state lacked authority to prosecute him because his crime took place within the boundaries of the reservation. The ruling means Oklahoma prosecutors can't pursue criminal cases against American Indian defendants in parts of Oklahoma, including most of Tulsa. And the court also said a New York grand jury can get President Trump's tax returns and other financial records. But for now, it's blocked out subpoenas for those documents. That's likely to prevent their public release before the election. Justices ordered lower courts to take another look at the congressional subpoenas. The case has tested President Trump's claim to protection from criminal investigations while in office. The president responded in a tweet, quote, "This is all a political prosecution." Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. And even as Mark was reporting the news, another headline crossed the Bloomberg, and that is that the FAA now is probing Boeing's alleged pressure on designated inspectors. That, of course, is in the 737 MAX situation, which continues afoot even as they're trying to get that aircraft back up and running. So once again, FAA is probing possible pressure put on designated FAA inspectors. In the meantime, let's turn to the USMCA. President Lopez Obrador of Mexico came to Washington yesterday, and President Trump took the occasion to say that the USMCA, that's the successor to NAFTA, is the biggest and the fairest trade deal ever. We turn now to our former ambassador, U.S. former ambassador to Mexico. He is Tony Garza. So, Tony, take us into the USMCA. You know the relationships between Mexico and the United States so terribly well. How important is this agreement?
Well, I think it's a terribly important agreement, and yesterday's visit highlighted it. As is the case, David, as you know, anytime two leaders, particularly the United States and Mexico, meet, there's some political objectives, some policy ends that you hope will be addressed, and some background noise, the critics. But I think the overarching theme was the importance of USMCA at this moment. Certainly, both countries have some real challenges with the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis, the collapse in the economy, both in Mexico and the United States. In the U.S., we have some very serious racial issues which we're trying to address. And in Mexico, the constant concerns about security and violence. So I think this was not only a moment that both presidents wanted to focus on something positive, but also a moment to reflect on the challenges that we can perhaps go forward addressing together, not the least of which are our economic growth and security. So I think in terms of the political objectives, I think they accomplished it. They exceeded expectations in terms of the tone and the essentially the pictures coming out of the meeting. Secondly, I think policy, while it's less clear, they did issue a communique. And if there's a commitment to implementation of UFCA in a timely and forward-looking fashion, I think that'll be good. And I think largely the critics today are kind of, recognizing that their hyperbole might have been misplaced.
Interesting. An awful lot of work went into this agreement. It took a matter of years involving Canada and the U.S. and Mexico. The question is there going to have to be more work done in the future? Do we get quietude? Already the United States is threatening possible tariffs on aluminum out of Canada, not Mexico, but Canada. But is there maybe bumpy roads ahead even on the trade front despite the USMCA?
Yes, David, I think you're absolutely right. As you know, we've spoken in the past, and at the conclusion of the negotiations, I made the comment that this agreement was greeted more with relief than celebration, largely because I think fundamentally Presidents Donald Trump and Lopez Obrador are not committed free traders. So the fact that we got to the end of the negotiated agreement was very good. I think as we go forward, you heard Ambassador Lighthizer comments of a couple of weeks ago. He said, we'll litigate early and often to assure compliance. What I'm hopeful is that rather than litigation, that there's negotiation around issues that are important to implementation. And I think you'll see them primarily in the labor area. The rules of origin with respect to manufacturing, I think, are going to cause some heartburn. Environmental concerns. you're already seeing that in spite of the fact that an agreement is placed, the threat of tariffs on aluminum in Canada, we are in a political cycle. So I don't anticipate it'll be all smooth sailing, but it's nice to know that the agreement is in force and there's a commitment to implementation.
How is the pandemic affecting U.S.-Mexico trade relations as a practical matter? I mean, I could see it as hurting because people do not want to have things crossing the border, or maybe helping because people would rather have things coming from Mexico than perhaps from other places. How is it affecting supply chains?
Well, initially, it was very disruptive to supply chains, and as you know, it's the level of integration between the United States, Mexico, and Canada is profound in terms of the number of times that components will cross those borders before they leave in a final product. And what you had was uneven openings in Mexico and the United States, where you had manufacturing facilities in Mexico that remained closed because of the pandemic, and those components or finished goods were not being able to move to the United States. I think one of the things that you'd like to see is better harmonization around supply chains. But there is a silver lining in this, is that I think we recognize that there is an opportunity for Mexico and North America to move some of the production away from more remote areas such as China and near shore. And I think Mexico, if they do some things internally in terms of making themselves more attractive to investment, and those are domestic issues, I think there's a real opportunity going forward as it relates to supply chains. But no, certainly the pandemic has disrupted everything in terms of both the supply side and obviously because of the collapse in our economy, some of the demand side as well.
Well, what about the collapse in the economy? Because obviously the pandemic has hit Mexico the way it has hit the United States. As I understand it, you may well have like negative 10% GDP growth, a tough 21. And so what is the situation with the economy there? And does President López Obrador, embracing President Trump the way he is now, does that help him back home get some of the things done he needs to get done?
Well, yes and no. Yes, I think not so much embracing President Trump, but sending a signal about his commitment to trade. And I'm hopeful perhaps a bit of a pivot in terms of his policies in Mexico as relates to attracting capital, providing more certainty and rule of law around investments. As you know, there was some fairly dramatic energy reform several years ago in Mexico, and this president has stepped away from the commitment to reform in the energy space. And I think that's a very important one for President López Obrador to reassess in terms of energy. They've also got to look at how they are going to not only position themselves vis-a-vis China, but further integration into this North American platform. And I think in that sense, López Obrador has shown some what many would characterize as a hostility to capital, or a lack of complete understanding of how important it is. So I think this is an important moment, but it's all in the going forward in terms of the implementation of the agreement and what President López Obrador will do domestically to respect rule of law and make the country more attractive to investment.
So briefly here at the end, Tony, in a nutshell, what is the plan for growing the economy? Because right now, Pemex and the energy industry has been terribly important. Oil prices are nowhere, goodness knows. So what's the plan? If it's not energy, what is it?
Well, that's been less clear. And that's been the biggest criticism of the president, that in the wake, the pandemic only exacerbated some underlying realities. And that was that there was no growth, that there was security concerns, and that this president didn't have a clear sense of where he wanted to take the economy. That's still not clear. And I think to hold out USMCA as sort of a magic wand is misplaced. And I think President López Obrador is doing a little bit of that now. What he's got to do is say, I'm committed to trade, I'm committed to USMCA, energy has a place in, and recognize that his nostalgia for a day gone by where Pemex was the big engine down there is no longer the reality of global energy markets. So there's a lot that has to be, I think that he's got to take a serious look at how he's approaching competitiveness in his own country. And it's not clear if he's yet willing to do that.
Always really helpful to get your perspective on these things. That's former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Tony Garza. He's now of counsel to White and Case. And now, programming note now, at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to get to talk with Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey, about how he's fighting the coronavirus, about what he's going to do with the schools, and how his finances are doing in the state, and much more. That's coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern Time today, and this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Stock of the Hour, and it's Walgreens Boots Alliance. The stock is falling as it announced it's going to have some layoffs, and there's going to do some stock buybacks at the same time. Scarlett Fu is here for a full report. Scarlett?
Yeah, David, Walgreens is the worst performer in the Dow and the NASDAQ 100, losing as much as 10% of its value today. The latest earnings report showed a loss for the fiscal third quarter. Net sales were flat, and gross margin declined as well. The full-year outlook came in better, or I should say worse than expected, disappointing investors. If you were to look at a Venn diagram of where Walgreens fits in, it's basically in the middle between healthcare and retail. It's on the front lines of disruption from COVID and longer-term changes in how consumers behave. So rivals like CVS Health are focusing on healthcare while it has to fend off Amazon's pharmacy ambitions. You look at the UK in particular, it contributes the bulk of the pre-tax profit, even though it doesn't come in as much when it comes to revenue. And in the UK was where things really fell apart. Traffic plunged 85% in April because of the lockdown, and that led to a $2 billion charge, David.
So what about back here in the United States? I mean, this was a critical element that we all could go to our drugstores no matter what. So you'd think they might have done better here.
They did do better. Comparable sales rose 3% as people rushed to stock up on prescriptions. But there's a divergence based on whether it's in an urban market or a rural market. We saw urban market sales drop 18%, and in the rural markets, sales rose 8%. So big split there. No matter where the stores are located, though, Walgreens spent more to clean stores and to pay employees. You could see that costs increased, and that led to a squeeze in margins for the period. So to address that, as you mentioned, it's going to suspend stock buybacks. No change to its dividend. Walgreens has a pretty juicy dividend yield of 4.9%, which is better than CVS. And over in the UK, where foot traffic dropped so much, it's going to cut around 4,000 jobs, and says retail conditions there will remain pretty depressed for the rest of the summer. David?
Okay, thank you so much to Scarlett Fu for that report on Walgreens. Coming up here, we're going to get to talk with Glenn Hubbard, former head of the Council of Economic Advisors, now at Columbia Business School, about the jobless claims and how the U.S. economy is doing. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Some more breaking Boeing news. Earlier report, the FAA is probing possible inappropriate pressure being put on some of its investigators. In the meantime, it's now said the Boeing 777X may miss its 2021 debut target. Top buyer Emirates says, that's the Emirates airline says that they may miss their delivery target at Boeing. So that's the Boeing news so far today. In the meantime, we also had jobless claims numbers out this morning, and they were a little better, that is fewer claims than was expected, but nevertheless, they remain pretty elevated. The economy still seems to struggle. We welcome now Glenn Hubbard, now with the Columbia Business School. Of course, he was the director of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. So, Glenn, thank you so much for being with us. We've got the jobless numbers. On the other hand, the equity markets really, although they're off a bit today, they've really been pressing up overall. The direction has been upward. Is there a disconnect between the equity markets and the underlying economic data at this point? Are we back risking what Alan Greenspan at one point called irrational exuberance?
Well, there may be, David, but it's not clear. I mean, the jobless claims numbers are good news, but there's still 32.9 million people on some sort of unemployment benefit. That's 20% of the pre-COVID labor force. That's not good. So why is the stock market high? I expect there's a few factors. One, the value of stocks, of course, is the whole future of earnings. And so if you're relatively optimistic about a recovery, most of the future is still fine. Second, the Fed's interventions have pushed down the discount rate for stocks and risk spreads. And third, sometimes we forget, the stock market's not the economy. It's dominated by some very large firms, some of which have market power. So the stock market may have irrational exuberance, but it's not obvious. But even if the stock market's high, it doesn't mean the economy's fine at all.
And is it possible we'll have a second wave here on the unemployment? I mean, I don't wish that to happen, but we had United Airlines saying they may have to lay off 36,000 people. Just today, we had Boots say 4,000 people. We've got Wells Fargo saying they're going to have to lay off 1,000 people. Is it possible as you get into the second half of the year, companies are saying, how can we have this be sustainable over the long term? We have to winnow our staffs.
Well, it is, David, for two reasons. Familiar in economics, supply and demand. So on the supply side, it may be that there's just not enough activity. In other words, that people have decided not to return to traditional activities. That slows hiring and rehiring. But the others on the demand side, we could have business failures as a result and credit market problems. So policy really has to provide some insurance against this kind of outcome. And of course, the virus itself may rear its ugly head again, which puts a lot of focus on vaccines and on therapies.
And Glenn, one of the subjects that you've raised time and again is the demand issue, whether there might even be demand destruction. Is there anything that we can do in a further round of stimulus or otherwise? What's the best plan to try to make sure we shore up the demand side as well as the supply side of the economy?
Well, it's a great question. I think there's two things, insurance and interconnectedness. And by insurance, I mean providing insurance that we don't fall out of bed in the economy. And by interconnectedness, realizing how businesses are interconnected. So on insurance, I would continue support for unemployment insurance, but not with the $600 additional benefit, which I think may have discouraged some people from going back to work. But there are ways to use triggers of state level unemployment and replacement rates to provide some extra benefit, but just not quite $600. We also need to give funds to states to help make up lost revenue, to help support community colleges that are going to be critical in rebuilding and retraining people. We'll need to continue support for small and mid-sized businesses. These are things like the Federal Reserve's Main Street lending facility. And we need, finally, more support for work, what I and others have called a pandemic earned income tax credit.
Well, take us through that, because I think we're basically familiar with an earned income tax credit. How is a pandemic earned income tax credit different?
Well, you want to support low-wage work and give people reasons to go back to work. From my way of thinking, the earned income tax credit is already a strong mechanism for encouraging low-wage work. We need to make it more generous. During the pandemic, we could increase its size significantly, proposed in a recent piece doubling it, but also making it available to childless workers. That is something that would really provide a boost to low-wage work when we need it, and probably a bridge to future policy, but definitely in the pandemic. Remember, unlike in the CARES Act, we're now in a phase where the economy's reopening. Our goal is to help connect people back to work, and that ought to be our mindset.
You also mentioned the unemployment insurance support, that we had this flat $600 payment. Some people are saying that might have actually encouraged, ironically, some people not to go back to work because they could make more money by being unemployed. You have come up with a proposal with Jason Furman, another former director of the Council of Economic Advisors under a different administration, where you would sort of feather that down and tie it state by state into unemployment.
Yes, in two ways, David. One would be to make it as a replacement rate of wages. You're not going to get figures as high as $600, but you'd still get extra unemployment insurance. And second, to key it off the unemployment rate in the state. So there would be triggers. If an individual state had a very high unemployment rate, these additional funds would be there. They would phase out as the unemployment rate goes down. That does a couple of things. It enables you to have a program that's robust to whatever the shape of the recovery is. We don't know sitting here today whether it's a V shape or some other shape recovery. It also avoids having to bring the Congress back to take action every time we learn something about the crisis. It puts the unemployment insurance expansion more on a trigger program linked to the economy and not to politics.
Glenn, how do you go about putting together an economic policy in this world? There's so much uncertainty, particularly driven by the biology, if I can put it that way, of the coronavirus itself. We have Vice President Biden now running for president. He's coming out with a plan that includes things like Buy America programs and investing more in clean energy. Does Buy America work?
Well, one thing we've seen actually on both sides of the aisle is this concern for Buy America and things like that. I don't think it's the right long-run solution, but I sense the problem our leaders are trying to come to grips with. which is there are Americans that have been left behind in a very open economy, open to technological change, open to international trade. We need to be doing something about that. We do need to encourage businesses to have more resilient supply chains, which may mean having more in the United States. But words like Buy America aren't as effective as that, even though they may be a good political slogan.
So, Glenn, if you were advising either Joe Biden, the former vice president, or the current president, President Trump, in putting together an economic plan going forward, again, given all the uncertainty we have, what would you put at the top of the list?
Well, I think two things. One is because of where we are starting now in COVID-19, we do need this insurance that we don't slip much further. One of the problems in the financial crisis a decade ago is we declared victory too fast. So we need that. Going forward, though, we need a real emphasis on opportunity in the country, helping to connect people to work and then reconnect them to work if things go against them. Tangibly, that means support for things like community colleges. That means support for low-wage work. I would love to hear more of this from both sides in the campaign this fall.
Are our community colleges really structured in a way that will prepare workers for this century as a practical matter? I mean, obviously there's a lot of community colleges, a lot of people go, but are they getting the training we really need for the jobs that will be there?
Actually, I think they are. Community colleges are the bright spot here. People often pay attention to very elite universities. Those are great. They're wonderful to have in the country, but they're not the foot soldiers for what I'm talking about. The problem when people say free community college or things like that, it ignores the resources needed to really stand up high quality community colleges. A lot of state governments have had to cut community college budgets, or they've chosen to do so. We need something that goes back to President Lincoln's Morrill Act of land grant colleges, or the GI Bill after the Second World War, that says we're going to make a massive public investment to reskill and skill Americans to prepare them for work. I think that's a huge winner economically.
Okay, thank you so much to Glenn Hubbard, now of the Columbia
Pleasure.
Business School. He's also, I'm proud to say, a contributor to Wall Street Week, which will appear again tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time right here. In addition to Glenn, we'll also be hearing from Larry Summers and from Dan Tarullo, the former Federal Reserve Governor. In the meantime, it's time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. According to the Associated Press, the body of the missing mayor of South Korea's capital, Seoul, has been found. Park Won-soon, according to his daughter, had been missing for a time, more than 7 hours after police launched the massive search for him. The Associated Press also reports that Park's daughter had called police today to report him missing, saying that he had given her a, quote, will-like message, and that the body was found near a traditional restaurant and banquet hall located in the hills. We'll, of course, continue to follow more information on this story and bring it to you as soon as we get it. The United States Supreme Court says a New York grand jury can get President Trump's tax returns and other financial records. But for now, it's blocked House subpoenas for those documents. That is likely to prevent their public release before the election. Justices ordered lower courts to take another look at the congressional subpoenas. The case has tested President Trump's claim to protection from criminal investigations while in office. The president responded in a tweet, quote, "This is all a political prosecution." EU and UK negotiators are still far apart in their attempts to reach a post-Brexit compromise. The European Union's chief negotiator said today there are, quote, serious divergences between the two sides. They're trying to secure a new trade deal before the end of the year. The sticking points include regulations for businesses and the fishing industry. The coronavirus is flaring again in parts of Asia. Hong Kong and Tokyo are reporting record spikes in new infections. The resurgences in the Asian hubs come after weeks of normalized activity as people return to work and restaurants filled up again. Both cities marked single-day highs today. Tokyo had been mostly virus-free for nearly 3 months. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much to Mark. Coming up, we're going to talk with Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican of Louisiana, and also a physician, about the fight against the coronavirus in his state of Louisiana. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Now, Louisiana, like so many states across the union right now, is fighting against that coronavirus. It had made some progress. It seems to be backsliding just a little bit. And now we turn to the Republican senator from Louisiana. He is Senator Bill Cassidy, who also is a physician, an accomplished physician, and taught medicine, actually, at one point as well. So, Senator, welcome back. Great to have you here. Give us your sense of where things are. Your governor yesterday said that you basically wiped out 3 weeks of progress because it's really spiked up in Louisiana.
Yeah, blame it on college students in bars. Imagine that. College kids go to bars, they don't wear a mask because they drink a beer and they kind of crowd in. And there's been a couple super spreader events which seem to be related to social events in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and elsewhere. So far, the ICU occupancy has been flat. The death rate has been flat, but the cases are going up. And so, again, young people being that, the problem, of course, is young people give it to older people. So we have to be concerned that there'll be a lag, but death and the ICU rate will go back up.
Well, I suspect you don't want to ban college students, but can you really ban going to bars? Can you clamp down on this to some extent, even with the college students, to try to fix the problem?
You know, the president, the governor is absolutely considering closing down bars. He asked the ones that were particularly involved to shut down. And so hopefully it raises awareness. I'm told that kids are coming back to school and the school is doing everything right. They're going home and playing Xbox with their buddies, and they're communicating it among each other from Xbox. You can imagine 4 guys, they're excited, they're on the couch, they're yelling and screaming, they're in each other's face. Well, you're in each other's face, you're passing along coronavirus. So young people are not affected. They tend to get it. They're asymptomatic. And so it's going to be a little bit harder to convince them they need to be careful.
And what about the death tally? You mentioned that it's not going up. ICU's not going up. Is that a matter of lag? Because, for example, Florida was showing a spike in cases, not in deaths, but now today the numbers were not so encouraging.
Yeah, so clearly it could be a lag time. One thing that we found out in New Orleans, though, most of the deaths were coming out of nursing homes. And the White House and CDC have put out regulations as regards nursing homes. People working in nursing homes are now checked weekly. I think that's the recommendation. So ideally, we're putting a ring levy around the people who are most vulnerable. And so if we do that, keep the cases from coming in, I'm hoping those most vulnerable will be uninfected, and therefore it'll keep our death rate down. But that said, if you have a population which has obesity, hypertension, diabetes, they may be younger, they're still at risk. So my warning to all folks is you may not have symptoms, but if you give it to the diabetic you go to school with, then she's going to have symptoms. She's going to be in trouble no matter her age. Please be careful.
So given all that, Senator, does it make sense to you as a senator and a doctor for the president and his administration to be pressing so hard for the schools to go back to actual classroom teaching come September? Because he seems to be really pressing on, I don't like this remote stuff very much. I want them in the classroom.
I am all for safely reopening schools, and we can do it. You know, the people that have paid the highest opportunity cost, given their risk of problems from coronavirus, is someone who's 5 years old. You're only 5 once in your life. And somebody says a word, and it's in a foreign language, but in context, you know exactly what they mean, and your brain absorbs that word. Wouldn't it be great if we were all 5 our whole life? But you're not. You're 5, you're 6, you're 7, critical ages. The more you're out of school, the less that you're going to be able to learn. My wife's on the board of a public charter school that teaches children with dyslexia, high risk for not learning. So when school shut down, they bought computers, gave Wi-Fi access for many of these children who are from low-income households. They found that 1/3 of the kids never opened their computer. Think about it. Parents are working, child's home by themselves. No one is comfortable with computers in the household. The kids at highest risk, low-income dyslexics, for being left behind in our new economy were those less prepared to do remote learning. So we can safely reopen. We know how to do it. We just have to implement it to make sure that kids are not left behind, because not every family is equipped to do remote learning.
Yeah, it's a really powerful point. Senator, I want to turn to a different subject here, one that you brought to us, actually, and it's Amazon and maybe some ill-gotten gains being sold. Tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, so Amazon just put out an announcement to sellers. Beginning on September 1st, they will begin to display a seller's business name and address on Amazon.com. And so this is consistent with what they do in Europe, Japan, and Mexico. Backstory, I've been working on something we call the Santa Act, where a gang will break into a Home Depot, for example, steal loads of fertilizer, and they put it up on Amazon, they sell it on Amazon, and then they shut down their site. Now, Home Depot is out the goods, the sales, but we've actually encouraged a cottage industry of gangs that go through. By the way, I'm told that in the looting that followed the George Floyd protest, that there would be organized gangs breaking into a CVS or a Walmart, systematically taking drugs and other substances, other products out, and then it would come back up on these seller platforms on the internet, and then it would be shut down. This is happening. Now, the way to begin to get at that is to display the seller's business name and address. Transparency, ideally, will begin to give tools against these sorts of gang operations. So Amazon, we're going to have a conversation with them this coming week, but in response to our bill, I'm sure other pressures, they are going to begin to display that business name and address. That's good for all legitimate business.
Yeah, Brandeis famously said, sunlight's the best disinfectant. Would you apply that to political speech too?
Yeah, I would. I think that it's a little bit caveat emptor, but on the other hand, the more that you know about political speech, the better. For example, there was a wonderful, just to kind of take this conversation a little far afield, there's a wonderful video where Ted Cruz is having a conversation with the editor of Psychology Today. And he says, the editor, that he voted for Hillary, but he thinks that big tech may have moved at a minimum 2.6 million, as many as 10 million votes to Hillary. Now, this guy is not, a Fox News contributor. He is the editor of Psychology Today. And he says if all you did was you knew from their social network page that people were going to vote for Hillary, and you sent a reminder to vote on that election day, but you don't send it to people that you know are going to vote for Trump, you move that many votes. It's a fascinating clip, again, from somebody who's a self-proclaimed Hillary supporter.
It is a fascinating clip. Finally, Senator, I don't want to let you go without responding to another thing that's in the news, this little falderall about your campaign funds being used for a membership in a club here in New York. I understand that your campaign saying nothing went wrong. Just want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, so we stay, it's a place where I stay in order to have campaign events. Some of that was, for example, misclassified by our accountant. It was payment for a room for a campaign event that was put in as dues. But if we did something wrong, we'll take care of it. Every now and then there's mistakes made. And by the way, I don't want mistakes made. If we made a mistake, I'm frankly glad somebody pointed it out. But some of that was a mistake of the accountant. So we'll figure it out. It's no big deal. It's not a lot of money. And so, every now and then folks make mistakes.
Yeah, well, except for me, of course. I never make a mistake. Just talk to my wife. She'll tell you that.
Hey, let me talk to your wife. I have a sense that that's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. No, we're going to keep her out of this. We're going to keep her out of this. Okay, thank you so much to Senator Bill Cassidy. He's a Republican from Louisiana. Coming up next, we're going to talk about whether we're going to really find out who the president is come election night. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, we all know we've got some big elections coming up less than 4 months from right now. And we all like to gather around the television set or our computer or our radio and try to figure out who is going to be the next president of the United States that night. Well, this year, it may be a little more complicated than that with a lot of mail-in ballots and other contests going on. Something that Chris Ailman, CIO of CalSTRS, talked to us about.
I'm not going to try and call this election, but what I think is a risk that the markets will really focus on probably not until about September, is the risk of a contested election. I really am fearful that this election is not going to go smoothly. We still will have a health crisis, questions about mail-in ballots. We may really find, just like the Gore-Bush election, and while that was only Florida, we may find this one locked up in the courts into November, December, and I hope not, but into January. That's not going to be good for the U.S. markets or the global markets.
That was Chris Elsters. He is the CIO of CalSTRS. And so we now move over to radio for our second hour of Balance of Power. Join us there. This is Bloomberg.